Boldwood presents The French Chateau Escape, written by Gillian Harvey and read by Lucy Scott. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Prologue. Spring. A sudden thud and crash on the stairs sent the tiny stick clattering from Emma's hand and across the uneven wood of the ensuite floor. There was a silence, then a single cry, a sort of animal sound, something that made her nerve endings fizz. "Mark?" she called, her heart thundering. "Are you okay?" It wouldn't be the first time her husband had dropped something down the stairs or stumbled slightly against the banister. The chateau's open staircase with its uneven treads was beautiful and solid, but they were rapidly finding out, impractical. 2 weeks ago, he dropped a tray holding 2 mugs of tea as he tripped on the curve of the stairway. It had made an outlandish crash that had had her leaping from under the covers with fright. Last Tuesday he'd managed to slip down 3 stairs, skidding noisily on his heel before staining the air with expletives. Only this time the air remained oppressively quiet. Emma waited for his cry of "bollocks" or customary shout of "It's okay, I'm all right." But nothing. Panicking, she pulled up her pyjama bottoms and rushed to the top of the stairs. As she clicked on the light, she could just see one of Mark's slippers on the curve of the spiral staircase. "Mark?" she called again, pulling her dressing gown around her and beginning to jog down, clinging onto the handrail. When she saw him, upside down, halfway between the upper landing and hallway, she let out a little cry. You didn't need a doctor to know when someone's leg was broken, she realized, at least not when it looked the way it did. "Oh, my God," she said, rushing to his side and grabbing his hand. "Are you okay?" He looked at her then, and even through the clearly agonizing pain, she could read a slight annoyance in his eyes. "Sorry, course you're not," she said. "I'll get my phone." She rushed back up the stairs as quickly as she dared and grabbed it from the bedside table, keying in 999, before realizing that number wouldn't work in France. Instead, she pressed 15, and phone clamped to her ear, made her way back to the prone body of her husband, who was letting out sharp, distressed breaths, his eyes closed. "You'll be okay," she said to him, rubbing his shoulder. In reality, she wasn't sure. Had he hit his head? Was the leg the worst of their problems? Or were other hidden injuries just waiting to reveal themselves? A ghastly head injury, internal bleeding. She felt they'd argued only yesterday about the stairs. He thought they needed a central carpet for safety. She'd criticized him for getting too hung up on small details. "In case you haven't noticed," she'd said, "we have a whole chateau to renovate, Mark. There's no point worrying about soft furnishings when you've got walls to demolish." Now this, proof that he'd been right all along. The stairs, their wood worn over the centuries by the chateau's occupants, clearly were a hazard. "Oui?" a voice said crisply on the end of the line. It took a while to communicate their whereabouts to the operator, but just 5 minutes after the call ended, there was a shout of "Madame" in the marble entrance hall. "Thank God," she said then. "Here," she said. "Ici." Mark looked paler now, the pain clearly taking its toll on the rest of his body. A film of sweat prickled on his brow. He squeezed her hand. "Emma," he said, his eyes still clamped shut. "Yes? Are you going to be okay?" She nodded, holding the tears back as best she could. "I'll come," she said. "I'll follow in the car." "Are you sure?" he said, his voice thick and gravelly with pain. "You don't have to." "Of course I'm sure," she said. "Of course I am." The 2 men who appeared in green overalls seconds later looked familiar. She was sure that the taller, bearded one had served her in the local tabac last week. He held a lightweight stretcher under his burly arm. The other man was carrying a bag. "Oh la la," one said to the other, looking at the twisted shape of her husband's right leg. "You have fallen, monsieur." "Yes," Emma replied on Mark's behalf, trying to keep the impatience from her voice. "Yes, he has fallen." The men exchanged a glance and grimace combination, which didn't exactly fill her with confidence. Emma knew that the local emergency services were largely made up of volunteers and, while trained, wondered if they'd ever seen a complicated leg break like this. Were you actually meant to move people? And how? And would they cause more damage if they didn't maneuver him in the right way? But she didn't have a lot of choice. She couldn't leave Mark lying there, and she wasn't about to try anything herself. The men set to work, and communicating in low foreign growls, they managed to carefully lift Mark onto a stretcher which, at the bottom of the stairs, folded out onto a wheeled gurney. Mark was almost silent throughout, exhaling sharply and reaching for Emma's hand, his face contorted with pain as they finally strapped him in place. "You are all right, monsieur," the larger man said to Mark in a surprisingly soft voice. "Do not worry. We will help with the pain." And tutted when she stumbled out a reply. "I'm sorry," she said. I'm new here. I can't. My French isn't—" "You wish to come in the ambulance?" his colleague translated for her. "Or to drive yourself? It is 30 kilometers. "It's okay. I'll drive. I can do it." She tried to keep the doubt from her voice. Since they'd arrived 5 months ago, she'd barely driven, too fearful of crossing to the wrong side of the road by mistake, letting Mark take the driver's position each time they ventured out. But this wasn't the time to be feeble. Seconds later, her husband was carried through the front door, down the ornate stone steps, then bundled into the back of a red ambulance, its blue lights flashing as it pulled silently away. She stood in the doorway for a moment, feeling a sense of unreality. It was 7 o'clock. She was still in her pajamas. The kettle hadn't even been boiled. She'd only been awake for 40 minutes, and what had happened seemed beyond surreal. But it wasn't a dream. Mark was moving steadily away from her, his leg in pieces, incapacitated in a way that seemed impossible. Her steadfast rock suddenly revealing that he was, after all, human and breakable. She stifled a sob. Outside, the world was already lighting up for the spring morning. Insects buzzed in the damp, overgrown grass of the front lawn. Beyond the iron gates, she could see the road curve away and the flash of an occasional car as people began their usual Monday morning routine. There was nobody she could call. She felt the yawn of the enormous hall behind her, the empty room stretching above her head, and she realized, as if for the first time, how small she was, how large the chateau was, and how desperately alone she felt. But this wasn't the time for self-pity, she told herself, pushing the carved oak door into place and walking quickly back across the tiles. She stopped at the corner of the staircase to retrieve Mark's slipper. It seemed so sad, like a shoe found at the road's edge after an accident. He'd tried to walk down the stairs in the dark, probably, not realizing she was already awake, not wanting to disturb her with the light. Her fault. Back in their bedroom, she quickly pulled on a pair of jeans, a t-shirt and a light cardigan, gathered her brown hair into a ponytail, and began to throw some things into a bag for Mark. What might he need if they had to keep him overnight? A change of clothes? Pajamas? His book, left dog-eared on the bedside table? A toothbrush and toothpaste? Grabbing them, she saw the white plastic of the ovulation test in the corner. Its tiny screen was blank. Faulty, of course. She turned the tap and filled a pint glass with water before gulping half of it down and setting it aside. She emptied today's dose of vitamins and medication from her weekly sorter and swallowed them in one go. Then she grabbed a banana from the fruit bowl, peeled it hurriedly, and took a couple of enormous bites before discarding it. Finally, she retrieved the car keys from the hook, grabbed her handbag, phone and coat, and made her way to the front drive. A sudden feeling of weakness came over her, and she stopped in front of the blue Renault they'd bought from a local garage when they'd arrived, leaning slightly against the glass of the driver's side window, taking in enormous, shuddering breaths. She wanted to feel Mark's comforting, strong arm wrap around her back, hear him tell her it was going to be all right, that she was fine, that she'd got this. She wanted to draw the strength from him, to feel him by her side and know that no matter what, He could make it all okay,